All right. For our second featured speaker, we have Nick Olkovich. Take it away.
Thank you, John. I love that introduction. This is so generous. No, I love it. I love it. I mean, that's great.
He really appreciated my overweening introduction.
Yeah, I feel a tear coming out.
I love it. So, honored to be here. Thanks so much. I'm not sure how I got invited to be one of the featured speakers, but I'm thrilled to be here. And so this is part of a project that, Joseph's a little bit aware of some of my work in this area, so is Reed. This is a sort of continuation of some other work that I've been doing recently on decoloniality and Lonergan. All right, so, and I've got some slides. I mean, hopefully that'll somewhat keep you awake. Some photos.
Your slides are famous for that.
Well, they're better than just looking at the wall. You know?
When you don't have rhetoric, you have slides.
Nice, that's good. So in recent years, there's been an uptick in scholarship that explores Lonergan's relationship with critical theory, including decolonial thought. John Dudosky's presentation here at Marquette in October, Lonergan, Decolonization, and First Nations Peoples, canvassed some of the best examples of this work. Notwithstanding some notable exceptions, there appears to exist a consensus among interpreters of Lonergan that although he is not himself a decolonial thinker, there are elements of his thought that are compatible with the decolonial turn. Roberto Goizueta, his comparison of Lonergan and the Argentine-Mexican philosopher and theologian Enrique Dussel in his excellent, albeit underappreciated book, Liberation, Method, and Dialogue, I think that was a dissertation he wrote here at Marquette, in fact, is one of the earliest and most thorough investigations of this connection. This paper represents a very modest effort to deepen the analogical North-South dialogue that Goizueta began over 40 years ago. My principal focus will be on Dussel and Lonergan's respective conceptions of and responses to the contemporary crisis of meaning, a crisis of legitimacy and of believing with important pedagogical dimensions. Unlike pedagogy, which refers to the science of teaching, pedagogics is that part of philosophy concerned with relationships of discipline or care, what Joseph Kamanchak terms authority relationships, where knowledge and or a command is received from another. Informed by Paulo Freire's work, Dussel develops an account of dominating and liberating forms of pedagogics, political and ecclesial, that align with his analysis of modernity and transmodern alternative, respectively. The latter fosters, critical consciousness on the part of Eurocentric modernity's exteriority, with an eye to constructing a politics that transcends rather than completes or rejects modernity. It's my contention that Lonergan's own take on the contemporary crisis, his pedagogics of self-appropriation and vision of Cosmopolis, complement but are also profoundly challenged by Dussel's critique of and response to modernity. This dialogue of mutual enrichment, an example of what Lonergan terms mutual self-mediation, will proceed in two main phases. In the first, I'll explore Dussel's accounts of modernity and transmodernity and their relationship to dominative and liberating expressions of pedagogics, respectively. In the second part, I'd like to explore Lonergan's account of secondhand knowing in dialogue with two texts, Lonergan's essay on the dialectic of authority and Insight Chapter 7. It's my hope that this dialogue will contribute in some way to the articulation of a pedagogics of liberation whose goal is a pluriversal and non-capitalist politics. So the first piece. Slide, there we go. Dussel distinguishes between two paradigms or models of modernity. The first views modernity as an exclusively European phenomenon that emerges in the 17th or 18th centuries before spreading across the globe. Proponents of this paradigm argue further that Europe's exceptional internal characteristics, modern civilization, philosophy, science, and subjectivity, allowed it to supersede all other immature and backward cultures. By contrast with this standard self-congratulatory narrative, Dussel adopts a planetary horizon that correlates the birth of modernity with Europe's constitution of itself as the center of history's first truly hegemonic world system. In this paradigm, modernity is not an independent or self-referential reality, but rather a system whose constitution is inseparable from the destitution of its periphery, the ontological outside that Walter Manolo terms the colonial difference. According to Dussel, the modern capitalist world system that emerges first in 1492 with the discovery, conquest, colonization, and integration of Amerindia, Europe's first periphery or exterior, is legitimated by what he terms the myth of modernity and its developmentalist fallacy. Blind to its own Eurocentrism, modern culture understands itself as superior to and more developed than all other cultures, and thereby obliged to civilize those deemed to be primitive or uneducated barbarians. This reading challenges the first paradigm's tendency to associate modernity with its Northern European expression, beginning with Descartes' ego cogito. And I apologies to Andrew if there's anything that comes up, you can chirp me at the end. A vision that neglects Spain's earlier management of the new center-periphery system in two interrelated ways. First, Dussel notes that the most pressing philosophical ethical question that emerged after 1492 concerned Europe's right to occupy, dominate, and manage recently discovered peoples and cultures. Dussel highlights the tension between the ego clamo of Las Casas, the author of the first, albeit unsuccessful, anti-discourse of modernity, and Sepulveda's articulation of the imperial conquering subject, the ego conquiro, that animates and justifies Spain's civilizing mission. Constituting the birth of modern European philosophy, Sepulveda's argument quells what Dussel describes as the restless conscience of early modernity. From that moment forward, the founding Eurocentric myth will simply be taken for granted. Second, Dussel contends that Descartes was also indebted to the work of Spanish Jesuit philosophers such as Francisco Suarez, and by the Jesuit order's wider engagement with the colonial project. According to Dussel, Spanish Jesuit emphases on method, mathematics, certainty, and most especially self-examination played an important role in shaping the Cartesian subject. The birth of the latter inaugurates a second stage in early modernity that is the product of the imperial difference that shifts Europe's center from Portugal and Spain to Amsterdam. Dussel regards the emergence of the Cartesian ego as one of the principal effects and not the cause of Holland's efforts to strengthen the efficacy of its management of the expanding world system. The exigency for governmentality found expression, as he puts it, in a simplification of complexity, a process of abstraction that rationalized a variety of subsystems, economic, political, cultural, pedagogical, religious, in ways that preclude self-criticism. At the center of this life world stands the disembodied and solipsistic consciousness of the Cartesian subject, whose pretension to occupy a tradition-independent zero point underwrites Western claims to universality while hiding its own locus of enunciation. This vision of knowledge, the economy, and of subjectivity is advanced and enforced in and through what Dussel describes as a dominative form of pedagogics that socializes the destituted to accept the contents of the reigning system. By contrast with pedagogy's focus on the mechanics of teaching, pedagogics names that part of philosophy that thinks through face-to-face relationships of discipline or care, parent-child, teacher-disciple, doctor-patient, politician-citizen, marked by an inequality of knowledge. According to Dussel, pedagogical projects defined by domination are marked by a static and toxic traditionalism, a gerontocracy, whereby the child community is taught the same, or is socialized into an existing system that represses their otherness. This process of domestication begins in the erotic household, finds expression in institutions such as schools, but also the church, and culminates in a politics that fetishizes the exercise of power as potestas, wielded by an elite that commands by commanding. Dussel's principal target in his Pedagogics of Liberation is the pedagogy of subjugation present in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Emile, a project that he contends typifies modern Western approaches that have sought to annihilate the other as other in Latin America. His principal criticism is that Rousseau's utopian vision of a purportedly universal culture, a vision that hides its bourgeois European roots, leads to the destruction of actually existing cultures. The father state's goal is to separate the child community from the mother people's culture, to transform the latter into an orphan, a child of nobody, and to encourage the child community's identification with imperial culture. Although Rousseau's school teacher or preceptor portrays himself as the representative of universal values, he functions as a bureaucrat of the father state that negates and then replaces the child community's way of life. From this perspective, the teacher is an active subject, the magisterial ego who must be obeyed. The student, by contrast, is an impersonal object, a tabula rasa who must be filled with the contents of knowledge, as in Freire's banking conception of education. The political goal of this monological take on the cross-generational encounter is a conception of potentia, the originary power of the community that has been depotentiated. The people become a passive mass that receives orders from and is manipulated by a ruling class. This is power as deified or fetishized potestas, separated from its origin. Dussel is clear that dominative pedagogics cannot be reduced to the school-student relationship, but must also be expanded to include other institutions, including the church. In Ethics and the Theology of Liberation, I think I got a slide for this, apologies. Oh, no, I don't. In Ethics and the Theology of Liberation, Dussel defines ecclesiology as the particular, quote, theology that deals with the political aspect of theology, end quote. He distinguishes between, but refuses to separate, the political relationship that ought to exist among the baptized people of God ad intra and the church's prophetic pedagogical function in world history. When the church neglects or falsifies its missionary role as an eschatological community called to speak a prophetic word from outside of the system, the results are totalizations of the church that identify the kingdom with European Christendom. According to Dussel, this is not authentic evangelization or mission, but rather conquest, a coercive process whereby the evangelizing word serves to integrate the newly baptized into a divinized civilization and institution that exploits and oppresses them. From this perspective, faith and catechesis become reducible to a concern for doctrinal purity by analogy with the banking model of education. Sin becomes privatized or minimized in ways that neglect its universal and political nature, and the notion of reform or renewal is turned into an intra-ecclesial affair that insulates it from crisis. That's the first piece. So to understand Dussel's pedagogical alternative, it's important to grasp how his diagnosis of and response to modernity's contemporary crisis of legitimacy differs from two standard Eurocentric approaches. In responding to modernity's overemphasis on instrumental reason, one broadly rationalist response to that crisis in the work of Habermas and Appel calls for the fulfillment or completion of European modernity's imminent ideal of rational emancipation. Although Dussel commends their shift in focus from individual consciousness to intersubjective validity, he is critical of the way in which formalist approaches to rationality neglect the material conditions that condition symmetrical participation in discourse. Dussel identifies a second, broadly postmodern response, the roots of which lie, as he puts it, in the work of Nietzsche and Heidegger, whose frontal attack on reason as such leads to nihilistic irrationality. Although postmodern authors are critical of, as he puts it, of the terror of modern reason, Dussel argues that they too fail to provide the critical tools necessary for identifying and overcoming Europe's management of the periphery. By contrast with both responses, Dussel interprets modernity's crisis of legitimation as a function of the breakdown after 500 years of modernity as a world system. More specifically, Dussel contends that modernity's civilizing mission has entered a terminal stage marked by two interrelated limits: the ecological destruction of the planet and the poverty, suffering, and possible extinction of most of humankind. The resulting proliferation of unmet democratic demands on the part of modernity's exteriority has led to a crisis of hegemony. In response, Dussel calls for the development of a transmodern alternative that seeks to transcend or subsume modernity by overcoming the world system itself. The project of transmodernity does not require a rejection of reason as such, nor does it represent the fullness or conclusion of Eurocentric modernity. Rather, it purifies modern conceptions of emancipatory reason through a liberating form of reason that affirms modernity's negated alterity. This is the background against which one can begin to grasp the nature and goal of liberatory pedagogics. By contrast with modernity's dominative approach to education, Dussel contends that liberative pedagogics requires a praxis of mutual listening between teacher and student, a dialogical relationship that is the conditio sine qua non of pedagogical love, as he puts it. For Dussel, the teacher-student relationship is always a relationship between active epistemic agents or subjects, both of whom have something to learn from the other. The authentic teacher does not simply communicate accepted doxa, traditions as traditional, but rather transmits that which is acquired in a critical mode that remains open to the creative revelation of the other. According to Dussel, the authentic teacher's first imperative is to listen patiently to the, quote, contrarian questioning, even insolent voice, end quote, of the child, youth, or people. This ability to remain silent before the mystery of the other, a mystery that is unspeakable from the perspective of the teacher's established world, is already a sign of the teacher's conversion to the trans-ontological being of the child. Dussel connects the teacher's openness to the other as a subject who has been negated in the system with what he calls ethical pre-originary reason. This originary recognition or analectical affirmation of the dignity and will to live of the other as victim constitutes the prediscursive a priori of every ethics, from which flows criticism of whatever subverts, as Dussel puts it with his material principle, quote, the reproduction or development of the life of each human subject in the community. It is the teacher's obedience to the cry or interpellation of the other that allows him or her to step outside of the system and to function prophetically or co-responsibly as a fertilizer, he puts it, who conducts students from a state of destitution to one of autonomy, fulfillment, and alterity, as he puts it. The teacher has a unique responsibility to speak the truth about the reigning system and to assist students in developing, as he puts it, and he's following Freire here, developing a reflective or critical consciousness that aids them in reclaiming their, quote, capacity to think and act creatively from the perspective of their own exteriority. This thinking otherwise on the part of the other is a product of a process of conscientization whereby the oppressed discover their condition as oppressed and emerged as privileged historical subjects of their own liberation. Far from being a skill learned in the classroom via the exercise of theoretical consciousness, conscientization names a praxis of liberation, a process of popular political education, as he puts it, that includes two interrelated moments, denunciation and announcement. Conscientization begins with the movement beyond the victim's spontaneous perception of reality, a false or naive consciousness that takes for granted the justice of the current order. Critical consciousness emerges from within the consciousness of the victims as they learn in dialogue with their teachers to diagnose and critique or denounce the system that is the cause of their oppression. This consciousness of themselves as a people, a social bloc that unifies diverse social movements against injustice, is the source of, as he puts it, a critical consensus among the oppressed that precipitates a crisis of hegemony. Emerging from below in just such creative moments, as he puts it, the hyperpotentia of the people finds expression in the positive announcement and construction of humanizing alternatives to the fetishized exercise of potestas. In both moments, the oppressed are assisted by a community of organic intellectuals who develop new critical human and social sciences that support the diagnosis of and response to the culture of domination. The goal of this praxis of liberation is not a sort of reverse domination, but rather a transmodern and pluriversal global society marked by, as he puts it, an obediential exercise of power in service to the flourishing of all. For Dussel, the church is called to play, I think I got a slide on this one, yeah. The church is called to play an important pedagogical role in this praxis of liberation. Patterned after God's breaking into the world in the incarnation, the church's principal function as a pedagogical institution in history is to invade the system from the outside and to speak a prophetic word that denounces totalization and that proclaims the kingdom of God. One is, as he puts it, born again as a disciple of Jesus through a catechumenal process marked not by theoretical study and memorization, but rather by an existential praxis that forms Christians to love the other as other, the poor who, in their exteriority, are the epiphany of God. According to Dussel, this commitment to liberation takes place in history, but is always oriented towards the eschatological future. The church is called to function as sign or sacrament of this future by criticizing the misplaced absoluteness of every finite and historically contingent order, and by supporting the creation of more just systems over and over and over again until the kingdom is consummated. The perennial calls for reform of the church is not somehow disconnected from her mission, but as he puts it, is mediated in and through her efforts to prophecy to the world by listening to the demands of the poor. In all this, theologians can play an important role, as he puts it, in strategic support of the church's commitment to liberatory praxis by employing an analectical method that denounces the system as idle from the standpoint of the Word of God and the summons of the poor. That's a very condensed account of some major themes in Dussel's work. Like really, it took me a long time to put that all like in that short little piece. organized around his pedagogics. Okay, so the question is, where does Lonergan's work fit here? Okay, my argument is, in one sense, one helpful way to get in on Lonergan's pedagogics as a starting point might be to focus on his account of belief or secondhand knowing. In Belief, Today's Issue, Lonergan describes the nature of human knowing as a group enterprise that is the work of many, with each adding, as it were, to a common fund. This division of labor in the acquisition and development of knowledge unfolds diachronically as the achievements of the past are accumulated, developed, and integrated by successive generations through a complex process of socialization and education. Roughly correlative with the sociological meaning of what the later Lonergan describes as development from above, this chronologically prior phase of development finds detailed expression in Frederick Crow's wonderful little book, Old Things and New. I couldn't find one that didn't have the library barcode on it. Apologies. According to Crow, this process, the so-called way of heritage, begins in the affectivity of the infant or child as they learn to love and trust their parents, and thereby gradually assimilate the meanings and values that will shape their experience and interpretation of the world. It's a super positive account of pedagogics. Very, very positive. As in Dussel, Lonergan notes that although this process begins in the family, it is also applicable to a wide range of pedagogical relationships of care, whereas Joseph Kamonczak argues person A trusts another person B to supply something which A needs but cannot provide for him or herself. Termed direction, as Kamonczak puts it in the broad sense, the something in question may take the form of epistemic authority, as in the case of an expert or teacher, or a command, as in the case of political authority. I would say this last point is essential to structuring a dialogue with Dussel's work. So what I'd like to try to do in what little time I have left is to read or explore this account of secondhand knowing in light of two other texts. Lonergan's short but very dense essay on the dialectic of authority, where he situates believing within a broadly heuristic account of power and authority, and chapter 7 of Insight, where I'll make the case that the longer cycle of decline and Cosmopolis are closely connected with what Dussel terms dominative and liberative pedagogics, respectively. Both texts point in the direction of persons, children, students, and citizens who can exercise some critical control over the ongoing development and exercise of power, authority, and tradition. Okay, so allow me to begin with the dialectic of authority and with Lonergan's three main heuristic claims. The source of power is cooperation. The carrier of power is the community. John was talking about this morning, right? And C, power in the world mediated by meaning resides, as Lonergan puts it, in the word of authority. So let me say something about each of those very quickly. First, cooperation is diachronic, but also synchronic in nature, where the latter, shaped and informed by the mediation of past developments from above, is roughly correlative with what Lonergan terms the good of order. Second, if cooperation is the source of power, the community that transmits the discoveries and inventions of the past and that cooperates in the here and now is the carrier of power. According to Lonergan, a community is something more than simply a collection of people who share geographical boundaries. Rather, community, the collective subject referred to by we, us, ourselves, exists only where individuals share, quote, a common field of experience with a common or at least complementary way of understanding people and things, with common judgments and common aims. Elsewhere, Lonergan articulates the various elements constitutive of communal consciousness by distinguishing between three interrelated forms of belonging: intersubjective, civil, and cultural, correlative with particular goods, the good of order, and terminal values, respectively. In Insight, Lonergan contends that social events are traceable to the two linked but opposed principles of intersubjectivity and practical intelligence, constitutive of what he terms the tension or dialectic of community. Intersubjectivity refers to a collection of naturally arising pro-social emotions and predispositions that ground elementary forms of cooperation beginning in the family. By contrast, practical intelligence is responsible for the development of the good of order, those institutionalized patterns of cooperation constitutive of civil society or community that condition the recurring satisfaction of vital needs. This is what Dussel regards as the material dimension of ethics. Lonergan draws a further distinction between the social order and the higher integration of spontaneity and practical intelligence affected by culture. Culture's web of meanings and values supply the criteria for assessing the relative value of particular goods and the institutional frameworks that serve their ongoing distribution. And as we know, I mean, I think many of us know most of this, I apologize, right? Culture includes at least two components: an everyday level of meanings and values implicit in social practices, and a superstructural level that is the product of, as Lonergan puts it, scientific, philosophic, and scholarly objectifications. Those are the first two claims, right? Lastly, Lonergan argues that power in the world mediated by meaning resides in what he terms the word of authority, or the sum total of current institutions, as he puts it. The product of use and want, this word is responsible for mediating past achievements via socialization, but also for directing cooperation in the present. It's within this matrix of use and want that power comes to be entrusted to individuals who function as authorities within the community. Like Dussel, Lonergan is clear that it is the community that is the carrier of power, and that the potentia of the community as a whole is the source of delegated and institutionalized power, as POTUS does. All this is broadly heuristic until Lonergan notes that authority is legitimate power, where legitimacy is a function of authenticity or its lack, and not simply a matter of conformity to some external standard or norm. Authenticity confers on power the aura and prestige of authority, as Lonergan puts it. Inauthenticity leaves power naked, or reveals it as fetishized power. This dialectic of contradictories finds expression in three different but interrelated carriers: the community or tradition whose word of authority is a function of past and present cooperation, those individuals who are delegated as authorities by the wider community, and those individuals who are socialized into the community and responsible for appointing but also following those they've appointed. This is the backdrop against which one might situate a pedagogics of domination and liberation. In the former, members of the community are socialized within institutions by authorities whose fetishized exercises of power form them to accept an inauthentic set of meanings and values. Those who are faithful to an inauthentic tradition fulfill what Lonergan terms minor authenticity, whereas those who seek to question or disrupt the prevailing system face sanctions, if not exclusion. By contrast, liberative pedagogics aim at forming persons whose critical reappropriation of the word of authority conditions the possibility of transforming the institutionalized exercise of power in support of an integral dialectic of community. So allow me just here in the final two sort of pieces to say a little bit more about both of those dimensions, starting with Lonergan's account of the longer cycle of decline. Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right, sorry. So the latter, the longer cycle of decline, hold off on that for a second. The latter is closely connected with the general bias of common sense, a bias that emerges when practical intelligence's overemphasis on the concrete and the immediately practical leads to a neglect of the long view, the higher integration, as Lonergan puts it, and disputed theoretical issues. The combination of general bias with both group and individual bias contributes to a succession of less comprehensive viewpoints that is the product of an ongoing disregard of timely and fruitful ideas, whose lack of implementation entails a cumulative departure from coherence. Co-opting culture in service to the palpably useful ends of a distorted practical intelligence, dominant groups create myths designed to rationalize their hegemony by villainizing their opponents and by cultivating a conviction that, quote, other forms of human knowledge are useless, end quote. The result is a pedagogics of domination that closely tracks Dussel's own critique of modernity. Group bias stands at the base of modernity's racialization of the non-Christian and non-Western other, and truncates the development of practical intelligence in ways that serve dominant groups, Christian and European, at the expense of the destitute. The collaboration of individual, group, and general bias contributes to the fetishization of instrumental reason, as well as efforts to impose capitalism and a culture of consumption and individual rights on non-Western peoples and cultures. This pedagogical project is legitimated by the screening myth of modernity that rationalizes the forced conversion of modernity's exteriority and that invalidates other forms of knowledge. Now, and this is the slide here, in this same part of chapter 7, Lonergan develops a very condensed four-step historical narrative of the longer cycle. I've given you 4 steps because I'm going to try to take us through those 4 steps, right? I'm going to read the quote, though. The medieval synthesis through the conflict of church and state shattered into the several religions of the Reformation. The wars of religion provided the evidence that man has to live not by revelation but by reason. The disagreement of reason's representatives made it clear that while each must follow the dictates of reason as he sees them, he also must practice the virtue of tolerance to the equally reasonable views and actions of others. the helplessness of tolerance to provide coherent solutions to social problems called forth the totalitarian, who takes the narrow and complacent practicality of common sense and elevates it to the role of a complete and exclusive viewpoint, end quote. The latter, as Lonergan says, abolishes every type of intellectual independence while perpetuating through force a conscious myth about the nature of reality as centered on that famous quote, economic development, the military equipment, and the political dominance of the all-inclusive state, end quote. According to Lonergan, it's, quote, ends justify all means, and those means include both, as he puts it, both every technique of indoctrination and propaganda, but also the terrorism of a political police, of prisons and torture, of concentration camps, of transported or extirpated minorities, and of total war. What I'd like to do is read the second, third, and fourth steps in this narrative in light of Lonergan's account of the evolution of human meaning, and to view transitions in this narrative as precipitating distinct but related crises of meaning, legitimacy, and or believing. The second step in this narrative of decline, I would argue, may be correlated with classicist or totalized negotiations of the modern turn to the subject that find expression in what Dussel describes as a tradition-independent zero point. Although this appeal to subjectivity was intended to be emancipatory, early modern philosophy's fascination with self-interested forms of autonomy and instrumental reason yielded a bourgeois subject driven to dominate the other. The disorientation caused by these developments contributed to a crisis of believing that was resolved negatively by Catholics in one of two ways. On the one hand, the institutional church turned inward and sought to retotalize Christendom along the lines of what Lonergan describes as the solid right. On the other hand, many Christians, we see this today still, sided with the solid right's totalized flip side, an anti-traditional secularism that reduced spirituality to, as Lonergan puts it, an inward affair of the heart. I'm inclined to correlate the third step in this narrative with the rise of an empirical or historically conscious conception of culture that contributes to the breakdown of modern conceptions of classicism and to the emergence of a populist moment, a post-liberal crisis of legitimacy. To say that belief is still an issue today is, from this perspective, to note that we are living through a contemporary crisis of meaning or believing that is a function of the breakdown of neoliberal hegemony and the return to tradition-dependent reasoning. In the absence of an adequate resolution of this crisis, the proliferation of unfulfilled democratic demands and neoliberalism's anti-populist rhetoric has contributed, in step 4, to the rise of postmodern variations of Christian nationalism that scapegoat liberal elites and experts as well as non-whites, especially migrants and Muslims. The return of classicism in its crudest and most authoritarian forms is not incompatible with the cover story that celebrates the return of the hyperpotentia or sovereignty of the people. In reality, however, the people have been manipulated to exchange one set of self-referential authorities for another. This rendering and updating, it's an updating, right? Like, as I was sort of saying in the earlier really fascinating conversation, right? We can read this in different ways. This rendering and updating of Lonergan's narrative of modern decline no doubt overlaps in important ways with Dussel's own account of modernity. I'm thinking here of his account of the movement from Descartes through Nietzsche in particular, but I'd also argue it is largely Eurocentric in its orientation. More specifically, Lonergan's narrative is principally concerned with exposing and diagnosing distortions in modern and postmodern Western thought and praxis, and not necessarily with the underlying myth of modernity that legitimates the modern pedagogical project of domination. Yes, his critiques of modern classicism, individualism, and totalitarianism are pointed, but nowhere does he link them explicitly with the establishment or crisis of a world system whose center is parasitic on the colonial difference. The tools are there, I would say, they're just not, he doesn't use them in that way. This is a blind spot in Lonergan's work that has been addressed, at least in part, I would argue, by efforts to radicalize and globalize his account of decline, and by a wide range of interpreters who seek to retrieve the voices of the destituted. It's my sense, though, that this gap demands a corresponding complication of Lonergan's resolution of this longer cycle. You guys all right? You sure? Okay. According to Lonergan, the longer cycle of decline can be reversed, and we know this, right? Not by appealing to, quote, any set of ideas on the level of technology, economy, or politics, but only in and through the attainment of a higher viewpoint in man's understanding and making of man, end quote. In Insight, Lonergan associates the needed higher viewpoint with the discovery of, quote, the principle that intelligence contains its own immanent norms and that these norms are equipped with sanctions that human beings, man, does not have to invent or impose, end quote. The discovery of this middle ground between modern secularist expressions of classicism and culturally exclusivist responses to the breakdown of neoliberal hegemony is a function of Lonergan's distinctive negotiation of the modern turn to the subject. By contrast with early modern conceptions of the subject as object, Lonergan's appeal is to the subject as subject's activity or praxis of knowing prior to any objectification. The identification of these norms entails a process of self-appropriation, whereby individuals advert to, affirm, and take open-eyed control of their natural desire for intelligibility, reality, and value. In recent years, Robert Doran has complemented Lonergan's emphasis on cognitive and existential self-appropriation with a call to appropriate the sensitive psychic dimensions of consciousness that underpin, accompany, and overarch, as Lonergan puts it, the orientation to self-transcendence. I would say this last point is especially important for a comparison with Dussel. More on that in a second. Critical self-possession does not generate, contrary to what some think, right? Critics mostly, does not generate a tradition-independent zero point, freed from all particularity. Rather, it identifies tradition-transcendental norms for discerning between legitimate and illegitimate exercises of power and authority in concrete social orders. The liberative potential of this unleashing of the creative vector in human consciousness is highlighted by a variety of commentators. As Roberto Goizueta notes, education for self-appropriation is, in this sense, coincident with the process of conscientization that affirms the other as a trans-ontological source of meaning, independent of or exterior to the dominant totality. The latter is, in a sense, the socio-historical incarnation, as he puts it, of the former. Put differently, again, this is Goizueta, the subject as subject in Lonergan and the other in Dussel performs similar functions in protecting the radical freedom of the person as someone, not something, that can never be, quote, fully comprehended within any contingent horizon of meaning, end quote. Goizueta contends further that Dussel tends to, as he puts it, quote, immunize the face-to-face encounter from any need for epistemological mediation. I don't think that's the case in his later work as much, and he argues further that Lonergan's meta-method can provide additional criteria for critically mediating conversion to the other that go beyond, as he puts it, the power of suffering in and of itself. Doran draws a similar connection in the opening of TDH, where he speaks of how Freire's liberative pedagogy helps the oppressed, quote, claim as their own the native capacities of human intentionality that Lonergan has, as he puts it, disengaged in a more general heuristic fashion. Likewise, in her discussion of African American women as a serious thinking margin engaged in epistemic disobedience, M. Sham Copeland links self-appropriation with the turn, as she puts it, to a new anthropological subject, the marginalized subject erased by dominating pedagogics. Now, the relationship, I would argue, between Lonergan's more heuristic approach to self-appropriation and Copeland's emphasis on turning the subject, hinted at in different ways just above, does raise questions about whether the former is genuinely transmodern. Here one might point to the distinction developed by John Didosky between the third and fourth stages of meaning, and note the ways in which Dussel complicates Lonergan's work. Although the latter's approach to interiority overcomes many of the limitations associated with modern negotiations of the turn to the subject, Didosky argues it remains deficient with respect to a subsequent turn to the other. Unlike Didosky, who appears at times to read this latter turn as like a new stage in the evolution of human meaning, on the other hand, I'm inclined to read it as a reality that is present in different cultures at different times in global history, and as an exigency addressed to the West in general and European North American theology in a unique way today. Dussel's critique of solipsism in modern Eurocentric theology, I think, is relevant here. This is one way to get in on make the point I want to make, and I'm almost done. I apologize. He draws a distinction between awareness, a way of being in the day-to-day world, as he puts it, and thinking about the awareness I have of things. The latter, which is a product, as he puts it, of a reflex movement, a turning in upon oneself to examine one's conscience. This emphasis on, as he puts it, health through self-knowledge, that Dussel associates in different ways with Descartes, Ignatius, and Freud, presumes that the one world that is thought about is the European world, an identification that reduces the other to an idea internal to the system I have set up. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that this characterization of European theology is applicable to Lonergan in any crude sense. In Natural Right and Historical Mindedness, Lonergan does associate enlightenment with the ancient precept, know thyself. But he notes that emancipation requires a multidimensional conception of conversion. And so I think one way of reading Dussel on this point here is to highlight how intellectual conversion, in the absence of moral, religious, and psychic conversion, can breed a sense of epistemological triumphalism and self-sufficiency that reinforces modern aberrations. The result, for example, is like an ivory tower approach to Lonergan studies, content to perpetually sharpen the upper blade, while either navel-gazing with respect to the reality of oppression or paternalistically attempting to include the other on one's own terms. By contrast, the fourth stage of meaning moves beyond self-referential forms of self-knowledge to include knowledge of the self constituted by the dynamics of mutual self-mediation. Dussel's reference to the pre-originary recognition or analytical affirmation of the dignity and will to live of the other as victim, as he says, the prediscursive a priori of all ethics, overlaps with, I would argue, but also enriches what Dodowski describes as an expansion of spontaneous intersubjectivity. The challenge for at least some interpreters of Lonergan, and this is, all of this is like personal narrative, right? Like a very bourgeois reading of Lonergan, not because of my teachers so much, but, breaking out of that. The challenge, I would say, for at least some interpreters of Lonergan is to, as Dussel puts it, to ascend from the abstract to the concrete. Together with self-appropriation, it is this turn to alterity, and by extension solidarity, that conditions the possibility of cosmopolis, the terminal goal of Lonergan's Pedagogics of Liberation. Closely related to Dussel's vision of a transmodern and pluriversal global society, cosmopolis is a critical cultural community marked by an obediential exercise of power that enables an integral dialectic of community. On the one hand, cosmopolis' heightened grasp of historical origins, its critical role, as Lonergan puts it, as a tribunal of history, entails exposing and denouncing illegitimate exercises of power and the screening myths that rationalize the dominant system. On the other hand, cosmopolis is concerned with directing the future course of history by seeking to announce and implement those fruitful ideas that have been pushed aside in the longer cycle of decline. The latter are not to be implemented via pressure or coercion as if cosmopolis, were a police force, but rather by appealing to the desire to know that is, as Lonergan puts it, too universal to be bribed, too impalpable to be forced, too effective to be ignored. Cosmopolis achieves these goals principally by cultivating authentic meanings and values whose mediation at the superstructural and everyday levels of culture conditions the possibility of a global social order that fosters the common good of all persons in the planet. Cosmopolis generates these meanings and values through a process of intercultural dialogue, oriented towards the birth of a world cultural humanity, a cross-cultural communitarian alternative, as Dorn puts it, to the pedagogics of domination that closely resembles Dussel's pluriversal alternative. Education for cosmopolis forms persons who are faithful to their own commitments, but also open to listening to and learning from the other, especially the voices and insights of popular movements, the hyperpotentia of the people that challenge the hegemony of modernity from below. Parents, teachers, experts, and politicians can contribute to this transmodern vision, not by imposing a program on the other, nor by seeking to include the other according to the terms of the center, but rather by supporting, indeed even suffering on behalf of, the people in their quest for dignity, critical consciousness, and agency. I would say that much of this is at least implicit in standard interpretations of cosmopolis, and yet I'd note that a transmodern reading of it requires something like what Jim Marsh describes as radical political conversion. And I would argue it also, and me and Tim can talk about this later, I think it also requires a rethinking of Lonergan's creative minority. I need to wrap up, so I'm just going to say something here about the church. This is the last page. I apologize. You guys have been amazing. Ecclesial mission today. In Insight chapter 18, Lonergan reminds us that the type of mutual self-mediation that cosmopolis seems to demand is dependent upon, as he puts it, a further manifestation of finality that he associates with the gift of God's love. Here it's worth returning to Dudowski's account of the fourth stage of meaning to highlight how the experience of vertical communion with God conditions the possibility of cosmopolitan collaboration at the horizontal level of human existence. As in Dussel's work, love of neighbor is coincident with the epiphany of or encounter with the absolute other God. In systematic theological terms, sanctifying grace and the faith born of the experience of transcendent value give rise to the habit of charity, a universal willingness that enables consistently authentic living. These transcultural realities find their outward historical expression in the Word made incarnate in Jesus Christ and in the latter's fidelity to the nonviolent law of the cross, the divinely ordained solution to the problem of evil. Grounded in the experience of transcendent value, fidelity to the latter transforms evil into what Lonergan terms the supreme good, an interpersonal state of grace, correlative with an integral scale of values or the kingdom of God. From this perspective, the church's pedagogical function in history is to proclaim God's love in Jesus Christ and to serve as a sign and instrument of the kingdom by supporting the cultivation of an integral dialectic of community until Christ returns. As a process of self-constitution in human history, the church as pilgrim people of God is perennially challenged to critique and repent of her complicity in the longer cycle of decline. I've named just a few of those instances, clear instances, and to foster conversion in all its dimensions. This prophetic mission and her ministry ought to proceed by way of authentic mutual self-mediation, a process that demands an openness to learning from and journeying with the other, especially those destituted by fetishized exercises of power within and outside the church. So much of this transmodern vision, and this is the very end, is concretized for me, I think, in a unique way by Pope Francis's contention that the church of the third millennium must be synodal, and that her credibility as a teacher is a function of her commitment to precisely this sort of mutuality. In the theology of the people, for example, the church as people of God can play an important role in the construction of an inclusive people as local neighborhood, nation, global society, an inclusive people committed to encounter and dialogue and attentive to the cry of the poor. This is one way of characterizing what it means to be, as Francis describes, at least for me, a church which is poor and for the poor. A church whose pastoral, or better, pedagogical conversion, its rejection of fetishized power, opens it to listen to, be evangelized by, and to love the other. Thanks.
That was terrific. Thanks so much. We have 25 minutes.
Oh my God.
Hope you ate your Wheaties.
Maybe there'll be no questions.
I'm just concerned I'm pegged as the Cartesian here.
No, I was just playing. I mean,
No, it's super rich. Actually, my real joke was going to be I consider Tim Muldoon part of the Comopolis that won't let me in.
nice.
The police will.
That seems counter to Cosmopolis.
No, but it's super rich. I wonder if you could say more about, well, how the decision gets to be made of the authority emergent from the community as magister. In other words, the great among us to teach us, and how that can be managed within an incredibly complex society where, as it turns out, there's you invoke Jim Marsh, and one of Marsh's critiques of the many was that, well, you know who's teaching are the bourgeois.
Yeah.
And you know what they're teaching them by their very incarnation is to be bourgeois.
Yeah.
And of course it was a self-critique of Marsh. Is one of his great concerns is here I'm in an institution and we're raising people to do it.
Yeah.
You know. And so you're going to decide by this vicious cycle that the only ones able to not even in a negative sense, but educated well enough are going to be from conditions that can be educated well enough. And I mean, I could say things about kind of the original, I think, genius of St. Ignatius, the Jesuits go to all corners. That is, do we do that anymore? Right, Tim and I have talked about this.
Interesting, yeah.
Concern today especially. So I wonder if you could say more about that dynamism, or however you put it.
It's a great question. I mean, the same goes, I think, for political authority as well, right? Like, who do we appoint, right, to these roles of authority that are essentially commanding us? right? They're commanding through obedience, right, to us as a people, or are they commanding by commanding? It's a great question, and I sort of hinted at this. I'm going to circle back to it. I wrote down some pieces here by saying I hadn't realized that Jim had that take, that it's he had a sort of self-critique. And I think one of the reasons why I've been sort of fascinated by the decolonial turn in the last sort of 2 years is because I've been challenged in a really unique way by younger scholars, and Reed knows this, in particular the Canadian Theological Society, where I've been a member for a very long time. Younger Latin American, but also indigenous scholars who have kind of, forced me to rethink it, not my sort of allegiance to Lonergan and the utility of reading Lonergan and the usefulness for me in the way in which I live my life, but to recognize that there may be gaps there, right? And so that's one of the reasons I think I'm coming at this, and that I've been slowly radicalized. It's taken a really long time, and I'm not there. I'm still like the bourgeois guy who's teaching, the bourgeois students how to do ministry in a bourgeois context. This is being recorded, isn't it? Jeez. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. But I mean, that's an everyday challenge, I would say, right? I mean, I think that's a real everyday challenge, and I mean, so I'll go to your point about, okay, so how do we appoint the teachers, right, who are going to, yeah. So the two things I would say, and Dussel's referring to Freire on this point as well, right? That there has to be. It's not. You can be an organic intellectual. You can be somebody that is journeying alongside the people in their quest for dignity. It's a question of how you go about doing that. Are you imposing a program? Are you imposing a set of meanings and values that are bourgeois, and that you're encouraging people to this is how you're going to be happy. You just need to sort of fall in line. And I think for Dussel, it's that very Levinasian point, right, of sort of just that face-to-face encounter, right? So that to be open to the creative revelation of the other is such a radical form of conversion that it's really almost impossible to explain. Do you know what I mean? Right? Like it's to encounter the other and to be transformed by that encounter in a way that opens one to the otherness, to the creativity of the other in a way that we can try to include them in our world. You know what I mean? But are we really actually open to the exteriority, right, of the other? To me, it's possible that people who are formed in a sort of a liberal sort of Western context could be transformed in that way, and I suspect that Dussel would agree, and Freire would agree too, right? That those are the types of people that should be engaging in the pedagogical project. I don't know if any of that makes sense. I mean, maybe it's a cop-out as an answer, but and I've seen glimpses of that in my own life, right? But not in a radical sort of way where I can just go all in, and that's been a challenge for me, I would say, and it's come in and through the voices of people around me who are speaking from the exterior, and then my role is to journey alongside them, right, and to support them and not to replace their agency. I don't know.
So thank you very much. This was extremely fascinating. I have two different questions.
Sure.
The first one is, would you imagine a dialogue between, how do you pronounce it,
Dussel, yeah.
Dussel and Ivan Illich?
Yeah, I can totally see that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Specifically, I'm not an Illich guy at all, like not at all. But there is a book, an edited volume. I think it's U of T Press, and I think it's Illich and Freire, and there's a chapter I think in there that explores Dussel and Illich. It's a great book, and there's a chapter on Lonergan in that too as well that Darren Diaz wrote. Yeah, it's U of T Press. I will find the title, and this is a terrible cop-out to that first question. I'm not an Illich guy, like I'm not, that's not a background, but I can totally...
It was not a totally...
Oh, no, I think there's some, yeah.
I don't know anything about Dussel, and I was thinking, the more you were thinking, I was like,
Him, the three of them, right? Freire, Dussel, and Illich, right? There's a lot of commonality.
Because I'm thinking, this is another, I was thinking about a possible dialogue between Illich and Maritain, for other, for the same thing, and this is a new horizon for me, right? Because they met in New York, Illich and Maritain.
Oh, okay, cool.
They met, and so there's a thing I'm exploring on the side, no longer gonna take it off on the side.
I love that.
So I was thinking, and then the other question is more Lonergan. Maybe I just wrote the wrong word, but why did you say when you were talking about the way of heritage, so the development from above onwards, a second-hand knowledge? Is that a negative connotation or no?
Just second as opposed to firsthand, right? So like belief as opposed, yeah,
So there's
yeah.
no specific negative connotation?
No, yeah.
Okay.
Correct, yeah. Good questions. I would love to hear more about that work. I think that's fascinating. Greg, and then Reed. I think Reed had his hand up too. I don't know who wants to go first.
Thanks for this was wonderful.
You're very kind.
Right, of course.
Sorry about that.
No, I like it, the energy. I have two questions that I think are unrelated, but maybe they're related. The first one concerns the last bullet point.
On this slide?
Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of mutual self-mediation between, members, viewpoints, in the Pilgrim Church is sort of a three-way mutual mediation, right? Because there's also the sort of mutual mediation of us in Christ. So I'm just wondering,
Sure.
and not only in terms of the historical form that redemption takes, but the sort of perennial form that sanctification, let's say, takes. So I'm wondering how you think about that sort of three-way dynamic. And
yep.
maybe just to ask them both at once, the question I think we're not supposed to ask, in what way does, and maybe this is how Lonergan, I guess I have two ways of asking, does Lonergan add anything to Dussel? And if so, what, and within that, could it be, or how would we think about the sort of reflective or critical component of accompaniment, right? Both of the self, as the one presuming to accompany in certain kind of ways, but also in our engagement with alterity,
Yep.
right? Which itself, if it's human, will itself be a mix
Yep,
of
correct.
oversight and insight.
Yep.
And so I don't want to short circuit
Yep.
to that question, right, as a sort of like naysayer at all, but it's something that I didn't sort of hear in the presentation that I'm sure you thought about and would just welcome your thoughts on.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's both excellent questions. I'll do the, I'll just writing it down. So the first piece, well, and this came up, I think I asked this was it John's earlier presentation online, right? That, about Romero and sort of this mutual self-mediation with Christ. I don't really see, to me, that's like a really, if you just focus on that, I mean, I'm not saying that's what John was saying, but I think the danger could be that, yeah, I have this relationship with Christ, I have this, and I'm talking to Christ and I'm deepening my relationship. What does that mean, absent my engagement with the people around me, right? So how do all three come together? For me, well, I mean, synodality is a journey of walking with Christ, right? Is a walking with people, other peoples, both within the church and in the broader sort of world, hand in hand with Christ. And it's the Spirit that's leading us on that path, right? So for me, they're all integrated, I would say, and that's the way I would take that first piece.
And then you don't respond to this, my concern. So I take your concern, and I think it's a real one. And my concern was sort of the opposite. I was sort of the guy working with Ardess in the university and the Cardinal at Newark to sort of do synodal groups, and that without the mutual mediation with Christ, especially refracted through American partisan politics.
Sure.
Synodality is sort of just reduced to a kind of
Correct.
Maybe more than speaking it past one another, but a merely sort of transactional kind of listening that people don't expect a lot from.
Agreed.
And that sort of human and not theological or spiritual in any sort of recognizable way. Does that make sense?
It's
That's a good point.
go ahead, Tim.
Well, just because I was thinking in this direction, because that would be the critique from within the church, that this is just a political ploy, by Francis, the haters, and so.
Right, but I think even beyond that, right, the sort of historical and social conditions in the United States sort of militate against whatever a thick understanding of synodality could be.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, there are never any political ploys when people who receive the sacrament of order are doing it.
Right. And then they're covered. It's a mantle. But I too was. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
Is it okay, Reed?
Let's finish this little thread because it's a good one. Then we'll go Reed and then Humphrey.
So
I'll write the
I
names
too
down.
Was thinking back to John's presentation about Romero, and specifically the fact that Romero had significant concerns with liberation theology in the early days, and had this perception that it was simply a political program, and effectively, did not perceive that it had that third. And you gestured toward it in your first bullet point on this slide, that there is a vertical communion with God that's also, implied. That's not merely, that we're doing something horizontal. So I was thinking about this because you're attentive, obviously, to the conversation with, modernity. And it seems to me that thinking about ecclesial mission, I mean, there's a lot, this is almost like an entirely different vector of consideration, because it's not the same kind of critique, it's coming from an entirely different place. But I think that point is right, that's the way to think about it.
Sure.
And specifically the pushback against synodality, being, I mean, you know, we could sort of, I think, critique it as a kind of classicism, church as mother and teacher, Christ the same, yesterday,
Yep.
today, and forever, you know,
Yep.
that kind of thing. But it's, anyway, my point just being
Yep.
that it's a very different vector from the one that has to do with, you know, philosophical modernity.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's fair. And I would say in response to the sort of, you know, both of these sets of comments about the synodality piece, pardon me. You know, one an anecdote and then a sort of a weird thing that I think through Lonergan and synodality on this one. The anecdote first. I'm on the Canadian Roman Catholic Anglican dialogue, which is now also Anglican Lutheran dialogue, because they're in full communion. And you know, all the Roman Catholics around the room are like, we love synodality. This is such a good thing, right? And all the Anglicans are like, have you been to a general synod? Right? It does become like this sort of parliamentary sort of, you know, just arguing back and forth at each other and then crying when you don't get your way and then, you know, storming out of the room. And like, these are bishops who are very open about their experience, right? They're very clear that they don't want to get rid of it, but it's a question of they're looking to Roman Catholics to sort of say, what can we learn spiritually about this practice, right? And I sometimes think about synodality as like, that's the scattered left, right? Take on synodality. That's just, it's the new church. We will create a new church, right? Not a different church, an entirely new church, right? Not a different church is more faithful to the gospel, entirely different new church. And that's what the critics of synodality think of synodality, right? So the solid right thinks of synodality as the scattered left.
Yeah.
And synodality is actually the middle ground between those two, right? Can I go to what did Lonergan add? If that makes sense, and then I got Humphrey and Reed, and you guys can argue who wants to go first. What was I going to say about that? I made just one point, right, about, and this is Goizueta's point, right, about how Lonergan adds something, like a criteriological sort of, you know, addition to the way in which Dussel's, like, basically, it's a very immediate sort of, you know, the turn to the other for Dussel is like, you encounter suffering, and it either happens or it doesn't. Like, how do you explain that, right? And so, Goizueta's point is to say that Lonergan adds, there's a critical sort of control of meaning that may be missing. I'm not so sure. Like, if you read Dussel's more recent work before he passed away, like the translations in the last 10 years, I think he's got a really, really thick account of rationality. I don't think it's grounded in the subject in the same way, but I think it's like an objectification, I think, of very basic sort of precepts in Lonergan. But I do think there's still something there that is missing in Dussel, yeah, I would say. Yeah. I had Humphrey and Reed. I don't know who wanted to.
Yeah, okay, fine. Thank you so much, Nick, but while you are talking, I have to be frank with you.
Please, we've known each other so well for 2 days now. I love it. Taking that bus up to the.
Did ride a
Some
bus.
of the positions, you know, I listened to you while you were talking, and I almost felt like, you know, maybe a fragment from one of the works of Nietzsche on transvaluation of values. You know, because your positions are very brilliant, very good, but the way the world works says something different. And that's why I also felt a little complication in trying to reconcile a few positions, some of them from what you said, especially from the inspirations or the works of Lonergan. You talk about, you know, synodality, and you cited Lonergan's positions on cosmopolis and universal viewpoint. I think in Method in Theology was talking about what he called perspectivism.
Sure.
Yeah, but then the problem I have is this. We live in a world that do not create the equal partners that can engage in this. And these things are rooted on either tradition or presumption that, for instance, let me place it within this imagery. I'm a priest, for instance. There's a presumption of higher understanding on someone who is a bishop probably not because he's more brilliant or he understands the situation better, but there's a presumption that his authority has vested him with higher knowledge of how things work out, probably privilege of information. And people will say, yes, Francis Bacon said that knowledge is power, but then power is also knowledge. So to some extent, he has that privilege. And then in that case, I want to know how to engage maybe a bishop on that equal ground. Now, like some of us here, we are teachers and we teach students.
Yeah.
There's also a presumption that the teacher has more knowledge than the student. So how do you engage these things? You know, how does the teacher engage in what I see, probably breaking down a kind of obediential structure that the teacher will now have to engage the student on that synodal structure, whereby we are used to a tradition where obedience is one way of learning, but in this case now we take off obedience. How does the expertise take you away from the quality, the inequality you needed to communicate, and place you on an equal ground with the students you are going to engage with, or in my own case, probably engaging a bishop?
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile this conflicting? I think Lonergan also talks about
Sure.
authenticity resting on the subject of understanding. If that is not presumed in the students, how does he, but it is presumed in the teacher, how do they correspond?
Excellent question. I was furiously taking notes. I'll try to make a couple of comments, because I think, and we can talk more tonight, obviously. The equal partner piece, right? Like, I mean, yeah, the world is not a set of sort of equal partners, right? Like, I mean, in baptism, though, we all have an equal dignity, right? And that doesn't do away with the authority of, you know, certain delegated sort of people within the community. I mean, the church wouldn't talk about delegation there. They would talk about ordination and so on and so forth. But at a certain point, any presumption to, you know, the expertise or the authority of somebody, it has to be testable. There has to be some sort of accountability. So if a bishop is like saying and doing all sorts of crazy things and doesn't know how to run the diocese, then that bishop should be accountable, right? That doesn't mean that, you know, the bishop shouldn't be, or those who are, you know, in that diocese shouldn't be, you know, in some sense teachable and open to, you know, what the bishop is suggesting in the pastoral direction that bishop might be offering. And I think the same goes in the classroom, right? Like all the best teachers or priests or bishops learn first and listen first, right? You can't teach with authority unless you listen to and learn from those that you're teaching. And I mean, I see that in the classroom all the time. I teach almost exclusively grad students now who are in formation for ministry, right? And so they're not like the 18 or 19-year-old who either doesn't really care whatsoever or will just listen to whatever you sort of say, right? And, you know, and sort of memorize it just for the purpose of the test. These are people who have real lives, like, you know what I mean? They got really challenging sort of things going on, and they want to share about it, right? And so the amount I learn on a day-to-day basis in the classroom from those folks about their lives, to me, that's like an expression of synodality in action. That doesn't do away with my unique authority in the classroom. But there is this sort of equal dignity that we all have, right? And they need to be able to be heard. And if they don't, I guess I'm failing at my job. I would say the same for the bishop. I don't know if that helps. I mean,
Very very quickly on that. I mean, I think that there's a way in which you don't have to pretend that there's equality of knowledge. But for genuine learning to take place, I have to hear what my students' questions are,
yeah,
because those are the thing to which the things I have learned can be an answer.
yeah, that's good.
And so I actually
That's a
can't
really good way to
teach
put it.
them unless I hear what their questions.
That's, I mean, you can try, right? But
I can
yeah,
present information to them,
that's good. That's good. Yeah,
but like you can't make anyone learn anything.
yeah, that's good.
Of all people, Martin Heidegger, just another quick example. And how often will you hear me interject Martin Heidegger? Make a point. But, I know, in his lecture,
Sorry.
which Heidegger wouldn't like. See, so Husserl finds his way back in somehow, but Heidegger in his lectures on Plato has all sorts of great lines. Heidegger, when he's reading Plato, is at his best. But he says, the best teacher is simply the best student.
Ooh.
Because of what John is saying.
Yeah.
Because they're able to listen, not just to the student, but to how the master would respond. So you have this idea of this, well, Heidegger would never use this word, but I will, humility,
Yeah,
right? That
Yeah.
they're able to know who the real master is. And so you have a sense here of, and you mentioned the sort of power and knowledge balance of, well, it's a position of service. That's what I think makes Heidegger.
that's good.
Yeah.
It's salvation of Heidegger, frankly, it's a redemption, is that he was a teacher. And he
Yeah.
thought of that as a service to such an extent, this is that when it was taken from him, he was contemplating suicide.
Wow,
Because he totally lost his vocation.
wow.
And if it wasn't for hiding in the hut and, people like Gadamer and Jean Bouffray and others coming to him,
Really?
Gadamer sort of says, like, look, he saved his life.
That's an amazing story. I love the line as well. And when you said the service piece, I mean, that's Francis, right? The inversion of the pyramid,
Yeah.
right? That, ministries in the church are services, right? Power in the church is a service, right? To the common good, right? And yeah, I mean, it's Congar's really very short little book on power and poverty. Is poverty, what is it? Power and poverty in the church? Such a good little book, right? Where he talks about this. Needs to be radicalized, I would say, but he talks all about this particular point. It's a really good.
Gaston Fassard is really good, and in his stuff on dialectic of spirituality, he's talking about election. The entire idea is God is electing you to be to serve.
Yeah.
Right.
I wanna make sure we can read, Chip Sands.
I was just thinking about Paulo Freire and his Pedagogy of Solidarity, which is one of his later works. He gives a lecture and somebody says, well, wasn't that just the banking model of education?
Somebody said that to him? Yeah.
And he says, no, my point is the form that the teaching takes. It's the intent. And my intent was to provoke you to thought, not to fill you up with stuff that I already know. So I thought that was interesting. It's also kind of a cop out. But lots of stuff. I want to talk about being a bourgeois person trying to pretend to be solidarity, but
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Some experience with this. But I wanted to, so I recently reread your lecture on Mignolo, right?
Yeah.
Seems like this is an easier fit. Again?
Oh yeah. In what way? Say more.
Well, it just seems like the pieces line up a little bit better. Partly because for Mignolo it's system to system, and Lonergan's system is pretty weak. Whereas in this case it's performance to performance.
Interesting.
It's like really strong there, right?
Yeah, interesting.
Does that sound?
Yeah, no, I like that, and I would say, Lonergan has more to say. Greg left the room. I respect that. Lonergan has more to say. There he is. Lonergan has more to say, I would say, to Manolo than he does to Dussel.
Correct.
Yeah, correct. Because Manolo is basically trying to have his cake and eat it too.
Mignolo is, you convinced me not to read Mignolo.
I mean, he's basically a relativist. He doesn't want to admit it, and that's fine.
But what's interesting here, I mean, this is the reason part of the reason I ask is because Maritain came up earlier,
Yeah.
and I teach this course on education, where I just lecture constantly, and I stuck Freire and Maritain together just because they seem to be kind of doing the same thing.
Interesting.
I had a theme that I wanted to work out that week, and Maritain gives lectures in Brazil, Freire attends them.
Interesting.
Writes about them, and so there might be a genealogy here that actually connects Dussel more concretely to Lonergan's own intellectual pedagogy genealogy as well. That might be interesting. It might explain some of that affinities that you're finding.
That's
I'm not sure.
no, I love it. I'm writing it
There could
down.
be intellectual genealogies that are connecting. Like
Yeah.
It's just branching on a couple different places.
Yeah. Nice. Tim, did you want to have that final word, and then we can?
I was trying to find a reference. The point that you were mentioning in response to Andrew, specifically about education. Hopefully it just gave an address a couple months ago, but specifically invoked diaconia as his model for education. So
This wasn't the 60th anniversary of.
that's exactly
Yeah.
that's exactly it. And I was trying to remember the name of it. It was Diaconia of Culture, I believe it was.
Yes.
Education and service to culture, but it just struck me as an example of the kind of teaching dynamic that or Pedagogics, excuse me.
Yeah.
He wants to position specifically the church's role as educator in that kind of way. I just found that.
I skimmed that document. It's a good document.
It is a good document. Yeah, I wrote a piece on it. I just found it the
summarize
right.
it for you.
Oh, you did?
No,
Oh, AI will summarize it for you. Oh, that's funny. You just wrote a piece on it. Okay, yeah.
Piece on it, yeah.
I gotta look that up.
Yeah.
Okay, that was fun, guys. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
I don't get to be in.